Hello again. I see the share screen option.
Yes, and it was definitely on my side.
No problem.
Yeah, I am just so I feel bad about it, but
It happens.
thank you for
It's a
your
learning
patience.
lesson. We know for next time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so there goes.
Okay. All
What
right.
did
I'll
you
give
do,
everyone
Evelyn, to
just,
help share with what happened in case one of us need it in the future?
Say what now, John?
Could you share with us what you fixed it in case we need it in the future?
I don't recall blocking it, and I don't know if with the new setup that Zoom has done, if they did it and I didn't go back and correct it.
Okay, so in your
But
settings.
I have not touched my settings, and Maya presented like last Sunday,
Okay,
and it was just fine.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, so I think it's just a matter, I think, going back and checking and making sure everything is ready to go.
all right, let me open up the screen so I can see you all. Okay. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. I will go ahead and jump in and get started. So my name is Angela Chandler. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. By trade, my business title is a business strategist. I work a lot in diversity inclusion. I help stand up diversity inclusion with an ERG at my company. My company is about 10 to 12,000 people, so that's pretty big. So that's a little bit about me. My technical training is in healthcare and business strategy, marketing, and communications. But as the years have passed, I've taken a like to projects around health equity and things like that. A little bit also about myself and the work that I do. Right now, you guys might have heard this before, the project, I'm a consultant at the MITRE Corporation. So I can change projects or duties every few years depending on how it goes. Right now, I'm working on what's called Indians Health Services. We're implementing a new electronic health records program for Indian Health. Indian Health is also part of the health disparities group. So we're looking to, looking at equity there as well as we're standing up the EHR, and that's as well as part of my job. And then the other project is working with the Veterans Administration. They have a newly formed office called ORMDI, which is Office of Resolution Management, as well as Diversity and Inclusion. And I'm leading those efforts as well. So I do a lot of work and talking in this space at my place of work, both professionally and then as well as an ERG, which is Employee Resource Group. So that's a little bit about me. I'm happy to share more, but that's kind of my introduction. So I will go ahead and jump in. So today I will say, after Evelyn and I spoke, we took a small turn from what I was planning to talk about, but I felt it was needed. One of the things that this is a little bit deeper in a deeper conversation today. So I'll try to keep things light. This topic can get really heavy, but I'll do my best to try to keep it light. But we'll be talking about racial disparities in law enforcement. So that is the topic of today, and we will go ahead and jump in. So ground rules. This is a learning opportunity, right? There are no dumb questions. This is supposed to be a safe space, right? So one of the things also I've learned, and also I try to encourage, is developing psychologically safe spaces. I've heard my share of stuff through the years, and it's all about education. And so this is why I do this, is trying to hopefully we can, at least if you have a base level line of education, you can start to understand what is going on, because if you don't understand what is going on, how can you fix it, right? You don't understand how it's put together and it broke, how are you going to put it back, back together? So please, 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 if you have questions, ask. I will not be offended, and I won't speak for anybody else, but as your moderator, as your speaker, I will not be offended. This is how we pick that, right, taboo in America. Actively listen with listening. This term, the law, don't apply. Very two different, right? With an open mind. share. Again, this is like I asked a couple times discussion. So again, get really degree provides statistics, right? And you'll see this on my screen. You're going, that's fine. Is opinion. I really, really encourage that. Yes, Bob, I see your hand up.
Your voice is breaking up. I'm missing about
Oh.
half of what you're saying.
Okay, is that for everyone?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let me try this. Try taking this on. All right. Is this better?
That's
Okay.
much better. Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's the headset. All right. Maybe it needs to be charged. Okay. So, a little bit about what I was saying, active listening. Please listen actively. Don't listen to reply, but listen to what the person's saying. What I was saying about disagreements, I'm happy to, we're going to disagree. It's a fundamental thing of life. If you're going to do so and provide an opinion, please have it backed in data. This is one of the things that I highly encourage. There's this saying, opinions, you can get it from anywhere. If you're going to provide a stance or opinion, please have it backed by a credible source. That is one thing I asked during our discussions. Please stay on topic. This topic covers a lot of things, and we can talk about those things in the future. But please, let's talk about the racial disparities in law enforcement. And there's a lot of causes and effects that'll come up as well. There's a couple that I'll touch on today, but they are literally their own presentation. So I will say that, and I will plug it for a later time. And please be curious and humble, right? You don't know what you don't know, and that's fine. But if you have curiosity, I will do my best to answer your questions. And if I can't, I will get you the answers. All right. So as you all know, I love to do icebreakers. I love to hear from everyone on this participating. Again, this is a psychologically safe space. If you are not comfortable sharing all of these, you don't have to do so. So please share what you're comfortable with. And we can go from there. I always like to start off just to kind of, open this space. I'm a pretty transparent person, especially in these spaces. So I like to, start off and, again, create that psychologically safe space. So I will do that. My name is Angela Chandler. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I am in Virginia, maybe 30 minutes outside of D.C. And one of the things I would like us to talk about is what comes to your mind when you hear the following terms. And these are different, and I will get into them today. Again, there's no wrong answers, but the justice system, right? Law enforcement, and then police shootings. So when I hear these terms, without, just again, I'll take my education out of it. When I hear justice system, I think of the courts. That's what I think of. Right. That's exactly what I think of. I think of the county courthouses that are down the street from me that I pass, on my way to work or getting dinner or something like that. Law enforcement to me is the police. That's what I hear of when I hear police shooting. Unfortunately, someone innocent got shot. Those are what comes to my mind when I hear these terms. So I will open up the floor for others to share.
I'll start.
Okay.
My name is Maya. I am in Chicago with some of y'all here. And when I think of the justice system, I think about injustice. I think about the fact that it is largely two justice systems, one for the rich and one for everyone else. And when I think of law enforcement, ACAB just comes to mind. And when I think of police shootings, it's too frequent. It's too many.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Schroyer. I live in McHenry County, which is northwest of Chicago, about 40 miles. more rural area than Chicago. When I think of justice system, I think of judges passing their own personal opinion on what's going on and what's appropriate for their vision of the world. Law enforcement, I think of guns, police with guns mostly, and police shootings. I'm always skeptical about, was it really necessary? Immediately, I question whether it was necessary to do the shooting. That's me.
Thanks, Paul.
I'll hop in. My name's Melissa, and I live in the Phoenix area and formerly from the Midwest. When I think of the justice system, I think of inequality. When I think of law enforcement, it brings up, I mean, on the one hand, I think too powerful. And then I also find myself spending a lot of time deconstructing what I thought of law enforcement growing up and thinking that these people were here to keep us safe versus the reality of it today. And police shooting, too frequent. And I get really tired of seeing things that say there are a lot of good officers out there, you know, lumping it, not, you know, one bad cop doesn't mean a bad police force, but it's got to be dismantled. Something's got to, it's just too frequent. I'll just leave it at that.
I'll go next. I'm Sue Sitton. I'm actually in Downers Grove, a western suburb of Chicago, but about 25 minutes out. And I'm sitting in the Downers Grove Democratic office right now, so that's where I'm volunteering. When I look at the justice system, it just, I think of incarceration and what happens with so many people that's unfair, and it's the inequality has been mentioned before, and it's just not right. Law enforcement, there's such a lack of accountability in the law enforcement system, you know, and it's, when I start thinking of shootings, or, you know, is basically it's power, and you know, it's basically it's just power, and that's abusive and horrible. So that's me.
Does anybody else want to share?
Hi, this is Becky. I'm in Oregon, and when I think of the justice system, I think there's oftentimes too much corruption or bias in the rulings. When I think of law enforcement, I think it's mostly helpful, and police shootings are too often unacceptable.
My name is Paul. I'm based in Miami. Justice system, I think polarizing, law enforcement, it comes to now political, and police shooting unjust.
Hi there. My name is Kate. I'm in Lake in the Hills, Illinois. And when I hear justice system, I actually no longer, I used to think it was a justice system, and now it's ironic. It's an injustice system is what I feel. I hear law enforcement and I cringe. I see militarization, and with police shooting, I associate trauma porn. It has become a world of snuff films perpetrated by state-sanctioned lynchings. That's what I'm really upset about. I mean, it's just constant. So that's what I hear.
I'll go next. Yeah, I'm Evelyn, and I am also in Illinois. And when I hear the justice system, I question, for whom is the justice system? And law enforcement is power, fear, doubt, fatigue. And for the police shooting, my question is always, why again? Why are you killing us?
I will jump in. I'm Rose Colosino, located in Orland Park, Illinois right now. And justice system, I think of L.A. Mastal. He has taught me so much. I want to buy his book. Law enforcement, as others have said, overuse of power, police shootings, I really think of the last two the same, inequities.
I think almost everyone shared. All right. All right, thank you all for sharing. I will give it one more minute in case anybody else wants to. I think we've heard from almost everyone.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm Susan Ugoji. I am from Manassas, Virginia. I'm also Angela's mom. When I think of the justice system, I think of injustice everywhere. Law enforcement is just, you know, somebody can start talking to you and try and arrest you for nothing. And police shootings, there are way too many of them these days. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Mom. All right. Thank you all for sharing. I know it's a heavy topic, but being able to share, I definitely heard some themes. I heard some commonalities across our thoughts and feelings, right? And that is portrayed by the world that we live in and the reality that we live in. So this is a really important topic. There's a lot of avenues, like I said, that create this, and that, so there's a lot of causes to this and there's a lot of effects. I'm going to briefly cover some of the causes today and some of the effects at a high level. Again, this presentation opens the door to a lot of other topics that we can talk about in the future. So I'll jump into the slide. This was the cause of the topic for the slide. I feel like this list of names is getting longer and longer for, you know, police brutality. I think it's really important that when we talk about these incidences, that we say this person was killed. This is a murder. This is not an accidental death. This isn't something that happened. I fell asleep and I didn't take my medication and I didn't wake up in the morning. No, this is one person using a certain level of force to take the life out of another person, whether it's one person or multiple people involved. So that is really important to denote that this person was killed. These people were killed in these situations. And also thinking about who passed away and who lived. So this is kind of the, this is why we're talking about this today. I think it's really important to understand the history. I'll talk about that, of why we're here, how do we get here, so on and so forth. I did want to open up the floor before we move on. If there's anyone that wants to share any thoughts or feelings about Tyree Nichols. Apologies. I'll go ahead.
One of my thoughts from this incident, which is so common now, is how many other people had been beaten like this who didn't die, and therefore it didn't reach the level of publicity that this did. And how many people are suffering every day from this kind of thing, but if they don't die, we don't hear about it. And how disgusting that is. You have to die to say this is wrong. It's disgusting.
I just want to point out how how quickly the Black officers were fired. When there have been beyond countless instances of white officers captured, brutalizing, and still have their jobs. You know, they're still out there working. And even the white officer that was involved wasn't named for a couple weeks, you know, so it's just so obvious. You can't unsee it.
Silence for moving on. Thank you all for sharing. I know, again, this is a really heavy topic, and if I were, you know, I could probably easily pull one of these names out, what minimum every month. And the stats kind of back that. Just some people get more publicity than others. The also thing I want to mention is that this has been going on for a really long time, with the introduction of our smartphones, which I'm glad we're using them to be smart, right? Is, you know, it's helping document what has really been happening behind the scenes. And, you know, the body cams are helping as well. So, so like I said, this is a normal topic, as we've heard, and as you all have shared some of your feedback on thoughts on, you know, police shootings and the justice system. This is, you know, a common topic, unfortunately, that we've been, you know, that has come around in that way, and therefore we need to talk about it. So how did we get here? I feel like a lot of people don't understand how we got here and why it's happening. I've read my share of literature on this topic, and a lot of people leave out the history. When you search things like this, you get a lot of I don't want to call them uncredible sources, because some of them are credible, but what you're not seeing is a version of history that's taught to us. I know across the United States, our history books vary. I've read some of these history books and it just doesn't make sense. I've heard things from, oh, slavery was optional, to, you know, really how they enforce slavery. I know there's a huge pendulum swing in how history is portrayed and talked about. And then when you pair that with Kate, one of the things you talked about was rhetoric. You talked about how, you know, you learned about the justice system and then how you're seeing it being implemented. Those are two different things. So, right, I talk about rhetoric a lot, and that's its own presentation that we'll probably eventually get to. But when you combine media with rhetoric, with reality, they don't always add up to be the truth. So those are kind of the causes. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here and why this is happening so often. So I purposely chose Harvard for the source and for this quote. So that way it shows, you know, Harvard is pretty unbiased and they have a very reputable name. So they talk about solving racial disparities as well in a lot of the publications and the articles and their peer-reviewed documents and studies that they put out. So this is a quote that I took from one of the articles that I've used and referenced before. But according to historians and other scholars, the problem is really embedded in the story of a nation and the culture. Rooted in slavery, racial disparities in policing and police violence are sustained by systemic exclusion and discrimination. It's fueled by implicit and explicit bias. So as you all know, I love talking about bias. It really, really fuels how we got here. I'm not going to talk too much about bias today. I want to save that for another discussion. Police bias is its own topic. I could easily spend like 3 or 4 hours talking about that. So we will get there eventually in a later presentation. But I do want to show, and any of you who have heard me talk have heard me talk about bias. It's huge. It's really a root of what we're dealing with today. And any solution, and I heard someone say it needs to be dismantled, needs a myriad of new approaches to law enforcement, courts, community involvement. and a comprehensive social change, which also includes education from the bottom up and top down. So I really want to focus on the top down because the top down is what we're talking about. So I think we all work, anytime you're part of an organization of anything, regardless whether it's PTA, whether it's, your job, growing up in a family, that top down, that's huge. So I'm going to talk about this really quickly before we jump in. The top down influence really creates the culture. So when you're growing up in a household, what your parents say, the life that they provide for you, that really influences who you're going to be when you grow up. The same thing at your job. If you have someone at the top who is very empathetic, make sure, values the employees, that is going to be a very different culture than someone at the top who's like, show me numbers. If you can't show me these numbers, you're out of here, right? Those are very different ways of leading. And so when you're thinking about that, what structure is at the top? How does it filtrate through the system? That's really what I want us to focus on today, the top down. Because right now we're talking, technically a lot of us are not in that community. So we are the bottom up and we're pushing our voices. Right. And sometimes it's getting heard, but there's a lot of blockers and barriers on that way up. All right, so I want to talk about the United States criminal justice system. So I put in justice system just to hear a little bit about your feedback. Before I started giving these, I just thought it was the justice system. As I researched this topic and really got into it and how it's evolved to where we are today, it's not just a justice system. They call it the criminal justice system. The justice system is made for criminals. So this is a new addition that they put on later to try to shape it for the media to say, oh, our justice system is for criminals. And it's easy to, again, pull that word in and pull that in with race, right? Criminals, race, criminals, race. So that's a very easy tie when you're talking about bias to pull all of those together. So I think it's important also for us to understand how the criminal justice system works and where it came from. So I'm going to talk about where we are today, and then I'm going to backtrack to how we got there. And then we'll talk a little bit about the effects of where we are and how it's created the world that we live in with the justice system. So the justice system, it is comprised of 4 components. They each have their own subcomponents, right? And I talk about this system in the same way I talk about healthcare. Because we are not a socialistic society, not saying that we should be, we focus on capitalism, our systems come together as a system, but they're almost unnatural. You'll see this in the healthcare system, and you will also see this in the justice system, but they are still a system that works together that serve the greater good. So the first piece is legislation, right? So that is the preparation of laws. That is done through lawmaking. It starts usually with our, Congress and goes from there. And this is its own topic that I can definitely talk about, how legislation and race have not always seen eye to eye. And again, this is its own topic, but it is really important to think about. This is, thinking from top down, who's at the top and who's creating these laws, right? So the other part of it is law enforcement. Law enforcement is usually the police. They're the people who enforce the laws, right? And so when you're going through the system, you're going to touch on all of these. So then you have, so when you are arrested by a law enforcement agent or a cop, you go to court, right? And then court is where your dispute is settled. You're either proven innocent or guilty. And then based on that decision, which is done by a judge, you go through the system of corrections, right? And that's the sentencing and the punishment that determines, how it's going to be happened. You just go on probation. Are you actually going into a facility? Are you going, so on and so forth. So those are the systems that comprise our justice system. And like I said before, it's not single and all encompassing like some of the other countries, which is why this is why we have so many people incarcerated, right? It's not an all encompassing institution. The network, and it's comprised of different jurisdiction levels, and this is also really important because there's federal, there's state, and then there's local. And that's also going to determine what type of court you go to based on, you know, what happened, how you broke the law. And that is also going to determine your corrections and the sentencing that you get and where you may or may not serve time. And all of that is really, really important, right? And I think people a lot of times, you know, forget that aspect, that there are 3 levels. So when you hear the FBI going on, you know, going in, that's federal. State laws, this is why it's so important. This is also why I push voting, because those state laws are also done by, you know, our congresswomen, our congressmen and women. So, you know, this is why voting is so important, because they're voting these state laws into effect. And then your local jurisdiction, again, kind of shame spiel. Does anybody have anything, any questions? Yeah, John, I see a hand up, yes.
You made the statement that the multiple levels result in more incarcerations. And I don't see, I'm asking why that is, because I mean, I look like, for example, Russia. I don't think they have multiple levels, and there's a lot of incarceration going on there. So I'm thinking, I don't understand why per se, the multiple levels results in more incarceration vis-a-vis what type of society is in general.
Yeah. So the multiple levels create complexity. So Russia is one big country, right? So in the United States, what makes us different from other nations is that we are the United States, and each state has its own state rights. They handle healthcare differently. They handle crimes differently. They handle all of that differently. So I mean, I'll just share something that's pretty evident in where I live. Okay, so DC is not that big. It's a city, right? And then outside of it, you have Maryland and you have Virginia. And Maryland and Virginia laws are very different. And I will say in a week, I go into DC, I'll say within a month, 1 month, I easily go into DC at least once a month and Maryland at least once a month based on friendships, networking, dinner, whatever the case may be, work. It's pretty fluid. However, these 3 districts have very different laws. And I will just, you know, say one. So if I'm a gun owner, which is, you know, very accepted in Virginia, I cannot take that gun, even if I'm going to run an errand, because I need to go to the grocery store in DC because they have something that I need. And I only live 20 minutes away. I can't take that gun into DC or Maryland. It's simple things like that. So when you start instituting those complexities, even driving across states, it creates more confusion, and people are not always aware of the state's laws. Same thing with using your cell phone. In Virginia, they were the last ones to out of DC and Maryland to say you cannot hold your phone and drive. So I'm crossing the border and I'm on my phone in Virginia, but I have to go across to Maryland because I'm having lunch with a girlfriend. And now all of a sudden I have to totally change my habits, right? So when you're talking about these changes, they're not consistent across. And, you know, this is, you know, a big debate is state rights. And as we know, some states, alcohol is another perfect example. You have some states that, you know, or some counties even that are dry and then some aren't. The way each state and county rules how, you know, how alcohol is distributed or sold changes. And so when you break those laws that you might not be informed about, I heard, you know, someone say also that, you know, they're originally from Chicago, but they moved. You know, learning those laws is really important because you're learning a new set of systems and laws that may not have pertained to your previous life when you lived somewhere else. Does that help?
Yeah, I can see that. I would, you know, as someone that lives not near state borders, really, I mean, Wisconsin's a bit away, but we're not in that scenario where we're crossing borders that often. So, yeah, that's my perspective, that when you're not crossing borders, you don't see that. But clearly I see it when I tackle climate change. One state does this, another does that. Well, the air doesn't know the difference. It goes across everywhere, you know, so I get the complexity part. Thanks.
Yeah. And that complexity changes also with how corrections are dealt, right? So you may have a, you know, one state that is really, really harsh on certain activities, and another state's like, yeah, that's not our, you know, That's not a big deal. So again, it's case by case basis, and that also adds the complexity as well. Does anyone else have questions on the slide before I jump forward? This is really important. That's why I want to make sure I have everyone on the same page. All right. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the history. So we talked about the current system and how it operates. Let's talk a little bit more about how we got here. So as we know, America was founded years ago. I'll just say that. That definition is still a little, fuzzy depending on which source you read. I'll stay away from that. I just want to cover a brief history, as again, we're focusing on race and the criminal justice system. So as we know, slavery was a big thing when America started, right? That was business, that was the way things operated. That was part of America's history and foundation. And this is before the 1600s. And the reason I bring this up, and you might have heard this before, is we are in the year 2023. So we are talking over 400 years ago, right? So you fast forward a little bit in history and you have the Civil Rights Act in 1864, which prohibited discrimination. During the 1980s, the federal, so this is interesting when I say this, when I talk about law, you have the Civil Rights Act, but then you have another strategy or legislation that's passed to counter illegal drug use and encourage treatment and reduce poverty. So we're talking about the system. They put laws in place, but how it's implemented by our, police force, that changes things, right? So there's an example that, I like to share. My friend gives this about policy all the time, and I use this as a perfect example. And this is something I think we can all relate to because we've all been to school. So you may have a policy passed. One of the policies that was passed for her school was talking about the kids need to be respectful. Well, respect is a very generic term, and it means something very different to me versus Bob versus Susan versus, I won't pull my mother because she kind of taught me respect, right? So going into parenting again, Kate, Paul, you all have different perceptions of respect, of what's disrespectful and respectful. And so when you are not part of the community and you're going into a community that is not your own, or one that you were not raised in that culture, that term, it can be exploded in so many different ways. So I say this because when we're looking at our system, these laws and how they're implemented don't always go hand in hand with their intent. And that has also happened throughout history. So basically that strategy has helped to create the police force and where we are today. So that also caused the prison population to skyrocket over the next several decades, again, going into our systems. So now taking it from legislation, right, which we talked about creating those laws, let's now talk about a little bit about the corrections part and a little bit about the laws and how they're implemented. So in 1972, before this came out, there were only about 200,000 people incarcerated in the US. In 2022, which is last year, there are approximately 2.2 million people incarcerated in US federal, state, or local prisons and jails, right? Again, talking about the three different levels that we have of our criminal system. We are the largest criminal justice system in the world. In 2015, over 6.7 million individuals were under some form of correctional control. That's a lot of people. And the US is a leader of its rate in incarceration. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the history of law enforcement and race. So one of the things that, again, going into our history, now we're changing gears a little bit. We talked about the system and how it's come to be. Let's talk about the origins of law enforcement. So this is actually a real image that I found. I've used this before. This is a slave patrol in 1858. Have people heard of this concept before? Were you all taught this in your history books? So, okay, I got some hands up saying they've heard of this before, but were you taught this in elementary history? I see, yes, right? We're shaking our heads no, right? Because this would make a big difference if they talked about where, really what happened during slavery. So the slave patrols were created in the early 1700s. Again, with the mission, and this is quoted, to establish a system of terror to squash slave uprisings, right? So this is the one thing when people say that slavery was voluntary. This is the question I pose, and I've actually had to have this discussion with people who are close to me. Think about what it would take for one person to make another person's family, not just that person, but mother, father, and the kids, and make them a slave. Think about the brutality, the mindset that you have to, what has to happen. And I'm going to get a little graphic here. Think about the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, and the potential sexual abuse that has to happen to make a person, a grown man, a grown woman, and their children slaves. To do work for you day in and day out, 10 hours a day for free or for piddles, right? Just enough to eat, cook, and live your life. So I say that because thinking about it in that way kind of backs that mission. Establishing a system of terror, that's what you have to do in order to keep slavery going, right? That is the reality. Were we taught that in our history books growing up, right? So this is why I say that history is really important, and really understanding what was necessary to make this system work. So that's, I know it gets deep and dark, but basically the slave patrols were allowed to conduct these actions up until the passage of the 13th Amendment. They were later replaced by militia-style groups who were empowered to control and deny access to equal rights, who freed the slaves. They systematically enforced the Black Codes. Have we heard of Black Codes? Yes, I see some heads shaking. Again, were these taught in our history books? Nope, right? So again, we're missing pieces of history that influences and tells the story of why we are where we are today. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Black Codes. They were strict local and state laws. Again, going back to those multiple tiers of law enforcement, right? So you found these locally, and on a state level, that really restricted access to labor, wages, and voting rights. And they were enforced by the Ku Klux Klan. And part of their mission was, they dominated the machinery of justice. That is a direct quote from, what their purpose was. So in the 1900s, okay, again, we're only talking about 100 years ago, when we started to establish local, the police departments to enforce the law. And guess what was part of the laws? The Black Codes. And so guess who they brought in to help do this? People who had experience, right? Who has experience? Ku Klux Klan. So this is really important in thinking about how, all of this was started. And this leads to such tension between the African-American community and the Caucasian community when it talks about policing, right? So yeah, that's a history of it, right? So yeah, and then Jim Crow laws continued through the end of the 1960s. I'm going to also say this, that the 1960s was not that long ago. It really, really wasn't. For us, some of us were born during this time, and our parents were born during this time. Based on who I'm, yeah, go ahead.
Can I say something? Yeah,
Sure.
this slide actually really resonates with me because I grew up in East Texas where this was the code. And I'm going to date myself, but I actually had to drink from that fountain that said colored only. I remember that as a kid. But what I find as an educator myself today, what I find so amazing is that even though, we learned about the Jim Crow in the Black schools, but the thing that I find so amazing though, is that people who implemented these laws and the KKK and all that, they had to have conversation after conversation after conversation to get it all together. And I bring it to the talking points that I see in the two political parties today, to where that rhetoric and conversation building is ongoing, and we are limited in ours. There was a ton of education going on, and there wasn't we didn't have the computers back in those days, but they got the message out, and that was so unfortunate. But that's what we're continuing to deal with also, because I can say that because I believe I'm reading this book now. It says stamped from the beginning. All of this was planned 400 years ago. And every generation has had a part in implementing that, and it has not relented yet.
Go ahead. Yes. Bobby, see your hand up.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me is I was in grade school and high school in the 50s and 60s. And it's a time when I remember personally a real safe time. The good old days of what the MAGA people would say was back in the good old days. And I had no idea what was going on in this regard in those days. It shocks me to realize how serious this stuff was even back when I was a child, and innocent of knowing what was going on and believing that my view of the world was like everybody else's. And I think that's some of the fantasy that people think about getting America back again. It scares the hell out of me. So.
Something Miss Evelyn said earlier too about the kind of continued rhetoric, the continued ideas that are allowed to proliferate, right? I think about the familial nature of police forces, right? My grandfather was a policeman, my father was a policeman, I'm a policeman, policewoman, etc. So when your great-great-grandfather was a part of the Ku Klux Klan, and maybe was involved in slave patrols before he became a quote unquote police officer, that mindset, that generational idea then is transferred implicitly or explicitly, right? Outward or inward, but those ideas get passed along from generation to generation. So even if you think like, I'm a good cop, I went to police academy and I'm doing everything by the book, but I still have this mindset, this like thin blue line mindset that came from my great-grandfather, who was tasked with ultimately just blocking people from having freedom in their lives. That's a tough nut to crack. And when we like allow all of these institutions to keep proliferating the way that they have been for years and years and years, it's only going to allow that mindset to also proliferate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The passed down generational bias. Yeah. Yep, Kate, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to kind of speak to the repackaging of the same thing continuing. Just like Evelyn, and other people here are saying, it's, now we have the Blue Lives Matter is the new Confederate flag. It's a new way of, at least that's how I perceive it, this new intimidation, this new reinforcement of white supremacy in a way that someone can feel proud of themselves, to reinforce the biases and reinforce the miseducation and completely flawed law enforcement system. this blind reinforcement over something that is terribly flawed, but at the same time pointing their fingers at poverty and people living in poverty existing and making them the bad guys, and making that, look how bad those people are. They're ripping people off. They're, brutalizing, blah, 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 blah. Well, look at our state sanctioned, constant brutalization of so many. But that was just what I wanted to point out. It's new packaging. It's the same thing, the same codes repackaged and made shiny for the new generation.
That is a really good point.
This thing that would come to my mind, and I guess me like looking at education and the state of even myself and peers and being an educator, where I'm curious, how do you get that yearning for knowledge? Where myself being 26, but like, is that something where the history or the way language or even just giving off the vivid or passion of explaining things where one's able to connect that and have that direct like sense of conscious being awakened, where there's a big gap in between that, and then it's like, okay, in different spaces of learning environments where you can be exposed to material like this, how that plays a big role just to someone learning and wanting to have an interest of understanding history, to want to take action, whatever passion that could be exposed from that. Always just find a sense of just wanting to see others, or just other students, or just young people, even just my own peers in our 20s and early 30s, who could see a lot of things that are recycling itself. Whereas even a conversation with someone who was sharing how we're repeating a lot of the same things, where it's like our grandparents, seeing this stuff, and the way they look at actions or people who we look upon as leaders, mainly take themselves as just utilizing it as a press conference rather than looking at, okay, let's establish policy in play. Whereas that just people are afraid of the encouragement that can take place of having a stance and saying like, okay, let's actually change this and make tangible results being shown, rather than just being complacent and complicit to just keeping the status quo.
Yeah, and we think you brought up actually a really good point, Paul. When we pull from our status quo, where are we pulling from? And who's developing the status quos? Yeah. Melissa, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that I continue to struggle with, that the more I try to educate myself, it's as if the more hopeless I feel. I grew up in a very conservative, white, rural Indiana place, and I know that place is still there, and I remember my mother, who didn't grow up in that area, would continually question some of the things that people would say, and then she was ostracized. And so I spend so much time thinking, I don't know how we're going to get past this except through a revolution. And I just don't know, because I think it's up to me as a white person to continually question. I mean, I remember when I found out that police officers originally came from the time when people were slave catchers. It was like, oh my God. And it's like, I shouldn't have waited. I shouldn't have had to wait until I was well past a grown adult to know that. And yeah, I just, it's obscene.
Do you think it would have changed your outlook on life? Have you learned that as a 12-year-old?
Oh, hell yes. You know, I mean, like, how could it not? I mean, like, I look at a lot of, you know, my interactions with people now. I mean, you know, you do better when you know better, right? And you've got to know better from the beginning. And yeah, I mean, it absolutely would have. I don't know how it could have not made a difference. I mean, the truth is a powerful thing, because I don't want to believe that there are all of these quote unquote horrible people out there that are just, I want to believe that they're just ignorant, but it seems as though, and that with a little education, things would be better. But there is so much hate that I mean, people don't just give up power. And that's what worries me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's true. That's, yeah. Maya, that's a really good point. Having to unlearn what we thought we knew.
Totally.
Yeah. And then that's a good question. I mean, you know, the thing is, I mean, I kind of agree. You know, we've talked about what does it take to really make this happen. Honestly, I'm not sure it'll happen in my lifetime, and that's fine. As long as I'm, you know, a proponent of that change to get us there, that's fine. But, you know, it takes time. I'm not sure, you know, what has to happen. I don't have those answers. I wish I did. But when we think about top down, things have to change at the top. You know, I've heard people say, oh, we need to rewrite our constitution. And I'm like, oh, God, that's a big step. But that is the top of our legal system. That is where our legislative laws are drawn from, is that fundamental document that also said that people of color were worth, what was it, 1/3? But, you know, again, drawing from that is where we get our current system from. So you take that down and it's, you know, that can create a huge instability. Yes, Kate.
I saw a documentary that a woman made. She had found out that her family had been slave owners and wanted to educate, because, you know, as she started to learn more and learn more. And I was, you know, this was a couple of years ago when I learned that basically, you know, we were taught that America was made because we want to be independent, but it was actually formed to continue slavery. Like, that is literally why they came here, so that they could continue that business model, basically, because England was shutting it down. And that is not a noble start to a country. So when you're saying from the start to now, you know, we really are starting from a really disgusting, ugly place as a beginning of a nation, which most people they don't know that. They really don't know. We aren't taught that. And the only reason why I learned that is because I voluntarily take myself to places so I can learn, you know, and it's not taught, and they don't want it taught. That's the thing, because when and that's, I guess I think of, you know, I have to admit that when I'm holding up a mirror to a MAGA person, I'm still seeing myself. I am a white person. I am where I am off the backs of brutality. I personally am a nice person, you know. However, my nice place in the world was on the blood and the backs and the anguish of others. And I think as white people, knowing that portion of pain that we have actively benefited from, people don't want to see that. Because if you take the pain of the individuals that were kidnapped, that had their children violated, brutalized, that pain is actually magnified to a level that is ancestral, that we aren't privy to. There's no way that my discomfort comes even close. And so I think that people choose not to do that. And they keep their bubble as a means of not having to do anything different.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to share before we jump forward?
Yeah, I'm a member of the NAACP, and kind of along the lines of what Kate's talking about. And I still go back to that book, Stamped from the Beginning, when we wonder why legislation has not been passed. From the beginning, the 400 years ago that we talked about earlier, I think it was set in place that you cannot have the legislation to make things right for people that you want to keep disenfranchised anyway. So there's not going to be any legislation but the fight for that legislation has to be continuous though. And I'm hopeful that one day that will happen. But the president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, just said in regards to the recent killing in Memphis, he said that by failing to write a piece of legislation, you're writing another obituary. And just think about the number of people that have been killed, slaves that were killed 400 years ago up to this very day. And there is no legislation to stop that. Why? Because it was written that way. I think it's part of the Black Code.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to see me as 1/3 of a person, why would you write legislation to protect me? You can't do it. Even though it needs to be done. And I wonder sometimes, even to this day, how much of a person do you really see me as? Do you really see us as the African-American community?
I was actually talking to someone, it was about something totally different, but it was about this idea of like Black people specifically entering spaces that are dominated by white people and using those systems to try and affect change from within, right? Infiltrating and then affecting change from within. But then I think there's been time and time again where we watched that, but then the people in power have then decided to change the rules within the system to continue to prevent those people who have infiltrated to a certain extent from actually achieving the highest levels, maybe overtaking, maybe changing the rules and making it easier for other folks to come into that system and achieve success. So I guess I'm not sure where I was going with that, but I think it kind of blends into this idea that the actual system, the people in power right now, right, the white people when it comes to racial equity, the men when it comes to feminism, the people who are in power of those systems, they need to decide and be forced almost sometimes to change, because oftentimes we can't, if we're just changing the rules when other people are trying to get into those systems and then change from within, we're still continuing and maintaining the status quo.
And that's the top down. That's the top down. What you're talking about is people trying to come from the bottom up to make the change and the top down stopping it. So now you have this conflict right here. Yeah. All right. I want to be cognizant of time. We have about 15 minutes left, right?
Well, we started 15 minutes late. If you guys want to hang around for that extra pickup 15 minutes, I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the things I want to, again, continuing the conversation, I just want to do a time check because I was like, we're going to start to get into some stats. So, which is important, but it's really helpful. Again, I'm a person that likes research, stats, let's back up these numbers by what we're saying, because if we're just focusing on words, we're going into that same thing that we've, are frustrated about, right? The rhetoric. So a little bit about the history of law enforcement and race. And I pulled this, it's an older stat. I did this on purpose. I know it's not new. So it's about 20 years old, but I wanted to show the history and evolution instead of just talking about what's happening right here and now. Let's talk about 2001. All of us were here. We were at different points in our lives. Most of us probably weren't thinking about it in the same capacity and way as we are right now, right? So with the evolution of technology and all that. So I wanted to bring this stat out as of 2001. This also year, to date myself, I graduated high school this year. So for me, I wasn't thinking about this, you know what I mean? So again, this is a time about 20 years ago. And these are the history of law enforcement race. So I don't want to leave out my Latinx community. So anyway, sorry about the typo, I have boys in there twice. But I wanted to bring this out that as of 2001, and the reason I brought this up is I was like, this could have been me, and this impacted those, African males and Latinas that were in my school around me. 1 out of 3 African Americans, 1 out of 6 Latinos, and 1 out of 17 Caucasians. Those are the numbers we're looking at. Apologies, I have a couple typos on there. But yeah, I think I duplicated, I did the wrong one. But the boys in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime. So I say this because when I saw that stat, I was like, oh, this can resonate with a lot of us, that are now tackling these issues. Where were we in this life? I know for me, I turned 18 this year. So these stats apply to the people that are around me. My friends of color who were my friends, their cousins that, I was babysitting. I mean, so anyways, I wanted to bring that up because it shows the history of where we've been and where we're going. So again, I don't want to get into, I can talk about racial bias in policing. That's its own avenue, its own presentation, but it is a huge cause of why we're dealing with what we're dealing with today. It takes many forms, many forms. And the reason it's so important is because, as I was talking about, okay, we have those lists of how our criminal justice system works. Policemen are the boots on the ground that are the ones feeding the criminal justice system, right? They're the ones that identify, you broke the law, this is how you broke the law, and this is what you are charged with, right? And then through the system you go. They are the gatekeepers, and we all know how important gatekeepers can be. So I wanted to put this out there and talk about that. This is essentially, the source of a lot of our criminal justice system. And again, we can talk about how those impacts are and the science around that as well. I'm happy to do that in the future. So let's talk a little bit about the effects of racially biased policing. So again, we talked about the history of police, where it came from, and how it's ingrained and rooted in that system from top, and now the bottom up is pushing a little bit, right? So let's jump into that. All right. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about African American community. I'm going to talk about the Latino community as well. So African American make up about 13.4% of the population. However, they make up 22% of fatal shootings. That's a lot. So these stats, it's also quoted by the NAACP. It's also quoted by Census. And for those of you who don't know, my husband works for Census, so I use that data a lot, right? That's why it's so important for you to fill out your centennial. That's where we get our data from. I also want to point out about this statistic, and I can quote this and we can talk about this in the future. 13.4%, considering how long the African American community, going back to our touch on socioeconomics and poverty, has been in this country, it's still only 13.4%. Mind the Latino communities building and rising greater in numbers. Anyways, that's a small thing I just want to point out. But these are some statistics about African community and how they're fitting into our current criminal justice system. We're talking about state prisons, and then the men, they face disproportionately harsher incarcerations as prisoners of other races. So I chose this picture on purpose because, as you can see, police interacting with a woman here. Now, I know I fit this depending on how I wear my hair, makeup, so on and so forth. My race can be very ambiguous. I have been confused for Latina time and time again. I am not, I am biracial. But again, when you have these mixing of cultures, you have women that look like me and her. And the reason the Latinx community isn't as well represented is, one, because the history really, talks about slavery and, and Caucasian. That's really where the history comes from. Then you have, this influx of Latinas into our community, and it's happening to them. It's not just African American community, it's happening to them. But the thing is, when you start talking about racial bias, the bias is the same across right? And that's why I said this is a separate conversation. We can talk about it more. But when you're looking at people of color, they're kind of lumped in. I don't know what her ethnicity is, but she can easily be lumped in as Black, Latina. And I'm not sure that the cops here that might arrest her really care about reporting her correct race. I don't think that that's a primary concern. And, I can definitely have data to back that, but that's not always the concern. So I do want to talk about, the Latinx community and not leave them out, because they are facing similar things. They're being enveloped into the experiences of the African American community. So, and it's also harder because they're not taking the same amount of data. So one of the things that's happening now is we have data to prove these things, right? So I'm able to pull out numbers. There's different organizations that are looking into this and providing the data and giving us that raw analysis. And they're starting to do it as well for the Latinx community. It's just it's one step behind. So it's coming, but I don't want to leave this topic out, because this is something that's just not happening in the African American community. I also want to bring up this stat in Chicago and Minneapolis, because I know I have some people there that would be attending. Latinos are killed at 6 times the rate of Caucasians. I know I have a lot of people in Chicago, so I really thought that stat was helpful. So also lack of standardized systems. Latinos are also a group of variety of cultures and experiences. Again, certain people in the African American community, range of skin tones, range of hair, all of that. And all of that influences race and how it's reported. All right, and this is one of the last stats. So hopefully everybody can read this graph. It's stacked. So this goes through, this is very current. This is by Statista. I like this website because they're one of the organizations that are really pulling together the information on policing and the effects of policing and so on and so forth, especially this. They've really came out in the forefront and provided these statistics on the best, data that they have. And it's been a struggle for them. You can see that on their website to collect this data. So again, as I was talking about race and how that's unknown, that's the green. So that's a lot of Latinas, a lot of, multicultural people get stuck in that unknown. Because again, and remember how I said it's not always important to document the race? You can kind of see it here, right? In the numbers, that green across the top, that's unknown. So you have white, you have Black, Hispanic, other, and unknown. Yes, you will see, yes, there is a decent amount of people shot to death, by cops that are white. But when we talk about the proportion of Caucasians to African Americans to Hispanic to other, what do those numbers look like? And that's the important part that we also need to think about taking away. All right, and I think I'm pretty much at the end. Yep. So that's everything I had to share today. I'm glad we got through everything in a good time. We have a few minutes left, so I'm just gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen and open up the floor to any thoughts or questions that anybody had today.
I just really appreciate the concise nature of the presentation, right? Because I think your point at the beginning that we can't really know where we're going until we know where we come from, and having that through line of where policing started, you know, I guess like how we started as a country, how our policing system started, and where we are today. I mean, it's directly affected. So I really appreciate the concise nature of the presentation today.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I'm trying not to, because there's so many topics, like I said, I was like, this one can be its own presentation. So really, you know, how do we get here? This is how we got here. This is why we're here. And that's so important. And I feel like if more people understood that and knew about it, we wouldn't have so many of the issues that we're having. You know, I think, is everybody still on? Yes, Rosemary, go ahead. I think she jumped off, but go ahead.
Thank you, Angela. This is the second time I've heard you present, and really powerful material. And as we've talked about, I think Melissa brought up, it is about educating, and then hopefully we can activate and make whatever incremental small change we can make. I wanted to make everybody aware. I have been living in Orland Park, but I'm a Chicagoan, and we are going to have an event tomorrow. It's sponsored by Promote the Vote. It's a group of multifaceted group of voting rights organizations, and it's about community policing. So I don't know if some of you have heard about it. It's called Empowering Communities for Police Safety, which is along the lines of what we've been talking about. So it's at 7 o'clock tomorrow. Take a look at it, see what you think, and hopefully this is going to be part of the solution. But with anything, there's challenges. So what we're finding is that the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, Maya probably knows about this, is putting forth their candidates. So this is something that folks have taken decades to put together, and there's challenges, but it does seem to be a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Jake, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering, are there any policing models like outside of our country that we can learn from or take from or encourage? You know what I mean? Because it's hard, you know, to tell people we need to dismantle this dysfunctional system. You know, it's killing people, which is theoretically the opposite of what's supposed to be happening. Where do we, you know, is there a system that has something more functional anywhere that you know of?
Yes, there are some. So when I look at the criminal justice system, there's definitely other countries that do it better. I think Denmark's the country where they really focus on the rehabilitation in their prison systems, unlike America, which is totally different. So the prison pipeline, which is funded, and you have now private organizations that are invested in prisons and their development and their outputs, which is using the people. That is a totally different conversation. We can eventually cover that. But yes, there are other countries that do it differently. The catch is, going back to my point earlier, is we are the United States. So trying to put a blanket on a state law. So this is why that stuff is so important, is understanding how America works, right? So trying to put a blanket legislation on something that is known for as a state right is very, very, it's like impossible. It's actually, I think by our Constitution, we can't really implement it. What we can do is kind of pick apart the system and try to make each one of them better. I think that the corrections is going to be the hardest, just because we've turned prisons into a way to make money based on the cheap labor and output, because we don't always have that in the United States. So that is our outlet for getting cheap labor in the United States instead of going to another country. So that is one problem that we have to fix. And until that is fixed, and that it totally ties into our socioeconomic system, it's going to be really, really hard, because policing is not done on, we don't have a federal police department. We have federal organizations that come down on people who break federal laws. But, our federal police departments are, they don't always have boots on the ground to really efficiently implement. So I'll also say this as a person who works for the government. So if we were going to stand this up, it would take a lot of resources and a lot of training that I'm not sure, 18,000 police agencies, I'm not sure our system, one, is ready to tackle, and two, to do it efficiently and effectively. So when you're instituting this level of change, it has to come from top down, and this is going to take at least 50 to 100 years, because you have to hold each one of those, what was the stat, 18,000? You have to hold each one of them accountable. And as we know, your weakest link is at the bottom. So how do you meet people where they are at, right? And then bring them up. And that's going to be, you have to start off, like, where are they on their level of maturity, growth, all of that. And then how do you bring them up to that level? That's a long process. It would take just almost as long as to, do a revolution. I mean, I hate to say it, when I look at the effect of thinking about that type of implementation from the government. Yeah. But yeah, there are models out there. They're just for smaller. So instead of, thinking about it for the United States, it's going to be the size of 3 of our states. So, John, I see your hand up.
My hand wasn't up for this, but it said PBS. I think 60 Minutes had one too with Germany, where they talked to people in the prison system at Germany. And the big takeaway I got from that was rehabilitation. Indeed, it was like rehabilitation was the focus of the prison, not punishment. And these were prison people talking about it. And so they have a lot less incarceration rate and a lot less repeat offenders in that system. I mean, it's just a better system. One thing I wanted to point out about that, I've seen examples, heard examples about policing, is how much it's a brotherhood. It's like they close ranks. It's, and I say they, I mean, I've seen a lot of instances of closing ranks to protect people who do wrong. And so, right away, Blue Lives Matter, that's a brotherhood approach, closing ranks on the blue. And I was at a tour of Soldier Field with my grandson 3 weeks ago. And it was a guy giving a talk, and he made a point of, he was an ex-Chicago cop who's now a fireman. And throughout his talk, just a talk of Soldier Field, he's bringing in brotherhood type comments about the police force. And some of them were borderline bias comments. It's like, I'm like, all right, I'm not going to, there's like kids, there's people, there's tourists. I'm not going to jump in here and create a discussion. But it's like, boy, if he was talking to me and my family, I would be arguing with this guy, because he's bringing in these brotherhood / bias comments into an avenue that had nothing to do with that, and so it's disconcerting, and it's hard to break that mentality down, I think. So that's about my ad for this.
Yeah, and another part of that is human nature. People want to be a part. They want to be a part of something. And, for some people, they'll take anything, especially if it benefits them. Everybody execute that in different ways. Yeah, Melissa?
Yeah, I guess lots of thoughts going through my head, but as you were talking, I'm sitting here thinking, well, what person in power is going to say, okay, I step away, this is wrong, I'm not going to do it anymore. And then thinking that thought against like, well, what can be done other than a revolution and the 50 to 100 years of, until change. But then I did have like one smidgen of hope in that I was thinking back on, like, I don't have any trust in national, like, presidential elections. I think that they're like, I know that's another conversation, but I'll just leave it there, that I don't have trust in presidential elections. But what I do know is, I am from Arizona, and I got very involved in the election this year because I felt like fascism was up for vote. And I did see like that banding together and thinking, well, at least on a state and local level and our federal representatives, those people I think hopefully can make a change. So then my question is, and I've, in the work that I've done, I've always heard that you have to start local first, that's your hope. So then I was curious if anyone knew of like local or state people in power, like truly in a powerful place, who are trying to do the right thing that we can support. I mean, and I know like moveon.org does a lot of that, but like, are there those folks out there that who are in power, who know that it's wrong, who are truly trying to make a difference, not just provide more rhetoric?
Yeah, Melissa, I have, I'm going to send this to you guys in an email, but this is related to the gun violence protection, and I don't know what's going on otherwise, but I don't know if you guys remember, I guess last year, a couple of years ago, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Hank Johnson introduced the Gun Violence Prevention and Community Safety Act. And they're getting ready to reintroduce that act again. So I'll send you that information, Rose, unless you can pull it up and put it in the chat. That's something that's ongoing. And that was actually the call to action for today, that we need to be contacting our reps on a regular basis, not just for an event like this, but I think it has to be a continuous voice that they know who we are. So I think that's going to be the power that we have to exert, the power that we have in ourselves. I'm not fearful that change is not going to happen, but I think it's going to take a lot of work on our parts. And I think that might be the fearful part, is that we sometimes are afraid to get our hands dirty, and we're going to have to get our feet and hands dirty to get this work done. That's what it's going to really take. And the fear has to be removed. I go back to the thoughts of the civil rights era. I go back to the thoughts of John Lewis and how he was beaten. Nobody wants to be beaten like John Lewis, but we're going to have to take some risks like John Lewis did, though, to make change happen. And we're going to have to be more strategic and contacting people and making sure they get to the polls to vote. That's where we really lose power, is the power that we have been given. We don't use it, and we're not encouraging other people enough, from my opinion, to vote. Really, every single time there's a local election, whatever, we've got to get the vote out. So I will put that in the follow-up email to you guys, then, what I'm talking about now. And then I have the telephone number. I think I might have shared that with you guys before. I have the telephone number where you can call all your people all the time. So I think it needs to be like a plug-in on your fridge, to where you're making contact and they know who you are. They recognize your phone number. It's got to be, we're that desperate. It's got to be that strategic. So.
The last thought I had on this topic, I want to go back a little bit. So when I first heard the term ACAB, all cops are bad. Ooh, that's a little militant. That's a little much. But then the more you learn, to John's point, right, to my point earlier, about the fraternal nature of police, and I'm also a true crime junkie, maybe a little bit too much. You keep hearing these stories about corrupt cops who maybe eventually something happens, some sort of justice happens, but it takes a long time. And oftentimes it's because they are being supported by other cops who maybe personally are good people, but they're choosing to support the institution over the right thing. And so it took me a while, but I'm firmly ACAB. And I think my acronym is more like all cops are biased, because that bias is then allowing them to justify, like, well, I saw this guy get brutally beaten, maybe murdered, but you know, the cop that I was working under, he was the one who told us that this is the right thing to do. Even though maybe in my heart, I knew that what I was watching wasn't right. So I think, and then to Kate's question earlier, right? Like, so that the system needs to change. You know, that fraternal mindset, that's not going to change on its own. It needs to be required to change. But then to Miss Evelyn's point too, we have to do the work. We have to change our own communities. So we can use that bottom up by changing our communities and changing the people that we elect into power, where the money that is given to each of our individual municipalities, where that money goes, we get to pick and choose. So we can say, like, we can fund the police department that is brutalizing people, or we can fund community health programs, which is going to be provide more service to the people. We get to decide that. But we can't change these systems on our own. We can do something small on a local level, but these systems that are in place and ingrained, we need to force them to change as a collective, but there are things that we can do, I think, ourselves while we're supporting, you know, a larger change in the system too.
Kate?
I just wanted to point out that the system is made to protect itself. So it's not even just the cops. We have the coroners that are declaring the deaths a certain way, you know. So those numbers that you provided, Angela, are, I'm sure, conservative, you know, because we do have the system correcting and adjusting and making it palatable to continue murdering people in the name of safety when it's not a safety issue. You know, they don't seem concerned about poverty, which is violence. They, you know, but beating an impoverished person as they are trying to escape their wheelchair, that's acceptable. You know, that's okay, but not, you know, the violence of not feeding these individuals, not giving them the health care so they don't go into bankruptcy, or, you know, these adjustments to reality, to the reality of what is happening, are so ingrained within, you know, even our, like here in McHenry County, they want to make it a gun sanctuary. You know, the police in McHenry County blatantly said they don't want to follow the rules, you know. So we have a system that is in our, you know, this is affecting us, that they're already on the side of murder, you know, as long as they're the ones committing the murder. I'm not saying they murder everybody, but they seem pretty okay with it. You know, that's their guns are the number one priority. And when you see that, that's an acceptance of violence at any level. And, you know, and then they have the coroner, I think he's a chiropractor, who supports that, you know, who is anti-COVID, you know, anything, you know, oh, the numbers of COVID people that died aren't real. Really? This is who we elected? And what did we have to choose from if this is the best we have? So, I mean, it just is so maddening how embedded in, how fused together it is, because then you have the judicial aspect that supports these cops, that, you know what I mean, it just snowballs, in which I guess that's, you know, why it's going to take over 100 years of, like Evelyn said, constant pressure and awareness that a lot of people don't want to see. They will fight it with their core because nobody wants to admit that we're a party to it, that our silence, and I had a sign when I was downtown once, it said white silence is violence. And actually one of the Chicago cops looked at me and smirked and said, white silence is violence. And I almost took it as a taunting of my sign. And, you know, what do you do when I'm a white lady? You know, I mean, how does that feel if someone isn't white? And that's what they're up against. You know, that's what people are facing every day. And so the fact that we have so many amazing people fighting against it, despite the exhaustion, despite the constant barrage of it not working, is phenomenal to me. That just, I don't know, it kind of blows my mind how infected the system is. And the more you see it, the more you see even more that didn't even occur to me. And I know this is not provided. This is not information. You have to seek it out in order to learn. And that willingness is, I don't see it in lots of people. And that's why I love spaces like this, because I do see the willingness, and it encourages me. You know, Evelyn is an inspiration. So many of you guys are an inspiration to me, because I need that, because even where I am in my place of privilege, I'm exhausted. And, you know, I don't know what to say sometimes.
I'm daydreaming as you guys are talking. I think what we have to do from this, not we have to do, but I think an ongoing podcast is where we're going to move from, go to. I'm hearing all these wonderful voices. We've got to get the message broader. We're a small group and it's awesome, but we can do a lot more with our voices. So hang around and look forward to some information. We've got some things in the work for a podcast.
Emma.
Yep, and some of the people on here are going to be invited. So yeah, I know who you are already. Okay, so I'm not sure if anyone else has a comment to make. I'm good for time. It looks like everybody might be a little bit tired now.
I know it's an exhausting conversation, but it's a necessary one.
Yeah, this was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much, Angela. And in your presentation, I heard you say that will be for a later presentation, which means you're coming back, right?
Yeah. This opens up the doors to so many topics.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah, I had a couple other ideas for today, but when this came, oh, you're welcome. When this came up, I was like, this is a good topic. We can really start, delving into other areas. But yeah, talking about, because I've talked about bias, talking about police bias, that's its own, there's stats and numbers around that. That's still, the data, as we say, is probably conservative, but there are, we're starting to delve into some of that. So yeah, there's definitely other topics we can take this and move forward with.
Okay, and just for the record, if you don't mind closing out, then I'm going to take us off recording and share a little bit more information with you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So, yeah, go ahead. I'll say I've shared everything I have to share.
Okay, and I'll get you guys the call to action then in the email, follow-up email. Because it's kind of long and I want to make sure you have access to it. But anyway, Angela, thank you so much. I feel like thank you is not good enough, but you're just a phenomenal presenter, and I so appreciate the time you've invested. And this was a lot of information, and it doesn't just like, it's not on its own. You had to dig deep for this, and your presentation style, I just feel like, oh my gosh, I can just sit here and just relax, because it's going to be, it's not going to be like I have to do something. You've already done it all. So I really appreciate just you bringing us into the conversation, and having everybody's voice heard. No one's condemned. Everybody has, share as you will. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I think John's hand was up. John, do you have a comment?
No, it was just a clap.
Oh, okay. All right. So thank you. I'm going to take us off recording